Ready to go? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming to our panel today on regional protection versus global innovation, which is a little bit of a wonky title, but we're basically here to talk about regulation v. innovation. How do we make sure that companies, particularly in the digital space, as we transition into this sort of new industrial revolution, can continue to innovate, grow businesses, grow shared prosperity, whilst at the same time not becoming monopolies, not enhancing the superstar effect, which was part of this economy. My name is Rana Faruhar. I'm the global business columnist for the Financial Times. I'm also an analyst for CNN, and I just wrote a book about big tech called Don't Be Evil, which is one of the reasons that they chose me to moderate this panel. And in my book, I kind of look at the 20-year arc of platform technology and why we have the situation we do now, where we really do have unprecedented levels of corporate concentration. We have growing concerns about digital job disruption. We also have amazing opportunities in the form of IoT, in the form of 5G, but many of these things are starting to intersect with the policy debate, with the regulatory debate, particularly because of some of the trade tensions you're seeing, the way in which the world is moving towards kind of a bipolar, if not a tripolar paradigm. So we're going to talk about a lot of those things. And we're really privileged to have a great panel here to talk about it. So I'm going to introduce them briefly, scene set a little bit, and then we're going to have a chat. And because we're a pretty small audience in a nice space, I'm going to bring you all in. You're going to have a chance to join the conversation, ask questions, and we're being live streamed, and this is on the record, just to let you know. So I'll just go down the line here. Directly to my left, we have Matt Granyard, who's the Director General of GSMA, which is an alliance of mobile telecom operators.
Yep.
Okay, great. To his left, I am very happy that we have FTC Commissioner Rohit Chopra, who has been really a star thinker in the policy debate in the US and will have a lot of interesting things to say. To his left, we have a futurist, Amy Webb, who was one of the first journalists who began to think about sort of big data and data as a sort of a vectoral way to think about narrative. She now has her own company as a futurist and a professor at NYU. And finally, on the end, we have Infosys founder and CEO Nandan Nikalani, who has a lot of perspectives on this topic, and in particular can speak to what's happening in India, where there's, I think, quite an undercovered story about some of the ways in which digital technologies can actually enrich from the ground up, rather than sort of oppress from the top down. So, with that, let me just maybe sketch some of the broad brushstrokes here. One of the numbers that I looked at when I wrote my book was an interesting figure it's actually from the McKinsey Global Institute that found recently that about 80% of corporate value is now living in 10% of companies, and those are the companies that are richest in intellectual property and personal data. And so we hear a lot about the US platform tech giants, the FANGs, but really if you look broadly, it's this particular kind of company that can capture the network effects, that can ring-fence data, and has a lot of power within the political economy. Some of these companies are very big lobbyists. Some of them own networks and do commerce on those networks. So kind of a new paradigm here, and it does seem, based on a lot of academic research, that as we shift from a tangible to an intangible economy, and I would say that that's a multi-decade shift that we're just in the really kind of maybe the end of the first stage of, there does seem to be a tendency towards a superstar effect. So there is this new risk of concentration. There's a lot of talk in the US about whether or not our ways of thinking about corporate concentration and antitrust, which are really based on Chicago school thinking about prices declining, whether that's even appropriate for an era in which a lot of transactions are sort of barter transactions that are being done in data rather than dollars. There's talk about whether we need to speak more about political power and corporate power. You know, are we back into a situation where it's like the 19th century and you have giant railroad barons that own networks and cars on the networks and the commodities in the networks? And so do we need to really think of a multifaceted way to ensure that you still have entrepreneurial zeal, that you still have SMEs that can take advantage of all these great things? So that's kind of the starting point. And I think I'm going to ask Rohit for you to jump in on this, because you've been so articulate on so many of these points and very brave. So tell me, as a commissioner, thinking about some very big cases, you guys are looking into pretty much all the big tech platform companies right now, big debate about this. How do you think about the changing landscape?
Well, I really am worried that not just in the US, but in the economy globally, that it is getting harder and harder to break in. And it's harder and harder to raise venture capital for so many different types of firms. And the consequences of that are real. That means less innovation, that means less growth, that means less jobs. And we need to remember that the enemy of growth and innovation is weak antitrust enforcement. And I think here's the two myths that I think are both false and dangerous that we're hearing right now. One is that if we enforce our antitrust laws, that's going to mean the end of free services and new technologies. That is utterly false. And then we're also hearing that if we do scrutinize some of these dominant firms, that's going to mean the West is not going to be competitive with China. This is something that Mark Zuckerberg has said, that Sheryl Sandberg has said, that Sundar Pichai has said. This is dangerous. We have to remember that what has kept economies competitive is when they are decentralized, when people can break in, when the next best idea disrupts the way of doing things. And I think that's really what this is all about. And I don't want to live in an economy where there is a set of corporate royalty who gets to choose the winners and losers. And I am worried that people are forgetting something. There are some, even especially in Silicon Valley, who believe that the wealth they have created is all due to their genius and their individual contribution. But guess what? The reason the United States was so ahead of so many other the regions of the world is two factors. One, it was the US government and our taxpayers investing in research that laid the groundwork for so much innovation. We know, take the iPhone, everything from touchscreen to GPS, so much of it is based actually on government inventions. That's part one. The second part is tough antitrust enforcement has fueled a boom of innovation throughout our history. And I don't think we would have a Google or an Amazon or a Facebook had there not been an antitrust action against Microsoft. What we saw in telecommunications, massive booms and advancements from actions again, with Bell Labs and unlocking a lot of that intellectual property that was put in vaults. So I think the choice we have is this. Do we want vigorous competition where new folks can jump in and be part of the fight? And will that deliver the innovation and prosperity that we really want as a globe? Or are we going to say we should coddle a few companies and depend on them for all of our breakthroughs? I mean, we're at a point now where we have companies proposing a currency.
Yeah.
And I think this is at the point where there are some things that there's now a blurry line between what should be in the government's domain and the private sector's domain. And I think we need to really look at this much more carefully than we have for the past generation.
Great sort of, you've got someone clapping in the audience. Great set point. Nandan, I want to bring you in because the point about digital currency is very interesting and very timely. There's been a ton of meetings at Davos, this Davos, around crypto. The BIS actually convened some meetings because they feel that central bankers and governments are completely behind the curve here. You have companies moving ahead in the U.S. You have China, doing its own thing. India has been an interesting case study where actually there's been a lot of cooperation, a lot of government directiveness around this. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how that's worked out and also the ways in which crypto and digital identity have sort of helped to work with the issues of inclusiveness and kind of making sure that the tech transition isn't a zero-sum game in India.
Sure. Thank you, Ron. Well, let me talk about what we have been doing in India for the last decade. And I actually worked in the government for 5 years building some of this, and I continue to be closely associated. And there are three pieces of the puzzle which have been built. The first is digital identity, and having a digital identity not provided by a company, but provided by the government, but in a way which is privacy protecting. So it's not collecting information about you as you move around. And today that program called Aadhaar has 1.25 billion people on it and does about 1 billion authentications a month. And it has done about 4.5 billion KYCs so that people can open a bank account or get a mobile connection. And it's also the basis for the world's largest cash transfer program. So the ID is linked to a bank account. There are about 700 million bank accounts linked, and about $32 billion has been transferred into people's accounts. So it's really a population scale project to give everybody a digital ID. And this is very important because this ID does not record your movement on the internet. So it protects your privacy. So you get this ID and use it. It's not collecting where you went, which side it's not like one of these data collecting giants. The second big thing which we did was build a payment system called UPI, Unified Payment Interface, that was built actually by a non-profit company called NPCI. This is a completely state-of-the-art payment system which is designed not to have a winner-take-all approach. So today we have every bank can participate. The transaction is in the banking system using the fiat currency. You don't need all this Libra kind of stuff. You just use the regular fiat currency. However, it allows big tech to participate by partnering banks. So Google Pay is on it, WhatsApp Pay is on it, Phone Pay, which is owned by Walmart, is on it, Amazon Pay. So you have a very healthy competitive payment system. And that payment system in October of 2016 did about 800,000 transactions. Last month, it did 1.3 billion transactions. It's fundamentally transforming the way. And now this payment system, which combines the best of both worlds, the regulated banking system with the creativity of consumer-facing applications go ahead, Rana.
Oh, I was just going to say, can you say, in these transactions, who owns the data, who holds the data? How do you?
Well, see, the financial data is in the bank. The bank is already regulated by a central bank regulation as to what they can do or do not. So that's why it's designed to be with the banking system, and it's with the full consent of the central bank regulator. But the front-end consumer app can be a Google Pay or a WhatsApp Pay. They don't keep the financial information. They just act as the front end. So you get the best of both worlds. You get millions of users. Like WhatsApp has 400 million users in India. So right now they only do it for 1 million, but when they fully expand it, so individuals will get access to the best payments, but that payment will be in fiat currency in the banking system. So best of both worlds. And very, very competitive. There's no winner-take-all here.
Interesting.
The third big thing, which is just rolling out, India will be the first country in the world where consumers and businesses will have access to their own data. This is the holy grail that people are talking about. It's actually getting rolled out. And we call this as the data empowerment architecture, which has three parts to it. One is you need a legal framework which is getting rolled out, which says that consumers are entitled to their own data, so I can ask for my own data. The second is you need a technology where 1 billion people in real time can get their data in snackable amounts from wherever it's stored. And the third is a new class of institutions, which we call as account aggregators. They are like data access fiduciaries who, on your behalf, manage your flow of data from source to destination, but they cannot look at the data. So it's a regulated entity. So when they get a license to operate, they are forbidden to look at the data passing through or take advantage of it, which is the problem we have, right? And the data is encrypted from source to destination. So to give an example, I'm a small business. I want a loan. I go to my bank and get my bank statement. I go to my tax system and get my tax details. I bundle all that in an encrypted way and give it in real time to a lender who then uses the data and applies AI and decides to give me a loan. Now this is going to be at population scale. So 1 billion people and 20 million businesses will have access to this. So this is the holy grail of data, which is how do we invert it to empower people with their own data. So these three big ideas, identity, payments, and data empowerment, is, we feel, the unfinished task of the internet, which has been taken up.
Yeah, and it's rolling out in real time. Okay, let me just ask you one follow-up question. In these 10 years, have there been cautionary tales or sort of positive replicable things that you would you would call out that folks in other countries should be really paying attention to?
Well, I think one of the important things we said was keep the ID limited. So we didn't make it a panopticon ID which collects information. It just has your name, address, date of birth, sex. So, but we have put in even more privacy features over the last 10 years on the ID side. The payment system was designed from day one to be, again, what's happening now is there's a global interest in this. ID4D is an outfit at the World Bank, and the 20 countries looking at a digital ID. The BIS just did a very important paper on the India model and said, how can it be replicated by other countries? In fact, Google wrote to the Fed saying they should implement the Indian payment model in the US.
Wow.
So that's quite a, well,
Okay.
we feel good about that.
All right, Amy, let me pull you into this conversation. You've stressed the importance, you believe, of data as personal property. How do you think about that? What does that mean? And also, do you have any thoughts on some of the ways in which states like California, for example, are starting to talk about a digital dividend or a digital sovereign wealth fund where some of that value that is currently harvested essentially for free from the individual might live?
Sure. Before I do that, I'd love to just offer a couple of reactions. So I'm a quantitative futurist. My role is to collect data, but then also find emerging trends and change and map all of that against very long-term scenarios. And so we do long-range risk and opportunity modeling. And I bring this up because while most of my job is focused on large corporations, I also donate 20% of my time back to the federal government because I believe very strongly in public service. So I want you to understand that before I'm about to say what I'm going to say, which is my observation is that policy and regulation historically are reactive. They are reactive in nature, and they tend to represent a knowledge gap and a certain level of anxiety. And they, as much as they intend to be plans for the farther future, they typically are not. And that's not just true in the United States. I observe this in other countries as well. And I bring that up because while big tech has proven itself time and time again that it cannot and will not police itself in a meaningful way, I think we have to take a step back and understand what the role is of these companies as they relate to all of the policy makers around the world. And that brings me to Libra. So yes, there are companies proposing their own currency programs, but we should stop to ask why. Is it the case that there's a ton of interest to be made, or why are big tech companies suddenly financial services companies, right? Why do they have a credit card? That doesn't make a lot of sense. As I explained to the IMF last week, the reason isn't because there's a ton of money to be made off of people. It's because we now see that the data is, the value to be derived from the data is now more valuable than the money itself. Which to me is analogous to the central challenge here, which is that our laws cannot keep up with the pace of innovation. By design, they shouldn't. We should not have constant change in our legal systems and with our policy frameworks and everything else, which means we have to think of another way around this. So when I hear proposals, I see California's proposal, I see regulatory frameworks, that tackle things like distributed ledgers and AI. In this case, we're talking about data. My question would be, how can you have that conversation in a way that's not so reductive? Because if we're talking about data, that's a big word. What exactly are you planning to regulate, or where do the rules fall, and how do you enforce every part of that data value chain? So forget consumer products like Alexa for a moment. There's data collection, there's data cleaning, there's data refining, there's optimizing, there's productizing, there's monetizing, there's archiving, and then each one of those things, and then there's purging. And each one of those things in each different industry has its own ecosystem. So this is like a very large, complex, thorny challenge. And I would just urge everybody to think through some of the downstream implications. Because if you restrict, if you require some kind of opt-in permission every single time a packet of data is transferred, no systems are going to work. The negative downstream impact there is that we potentially are going to miss out on truly valuable things like cures to diseases and stuff. So there's got to be a happy middle. To that end, if it's the case that data itself does not hold the value, which it doesn't, it's all of the processes around those data, then I think we ought to ask ourselves, what does that mean going forward? And so what should the whole entire value chain of data look like from both a policy perspective and a commercial perspective? So one of the things that I've been playing with and pitching around is a digital dividend. Is there a way for consumers to derive some value? If there was a way for consumers to derive some value each time a packet of data moves in a way that didn't gunk up the system, that would require a couple of things. That would require some kind of transparency that doesn't exist right now. Right now, there's no mechanism to force transparency. Two, the universal basic income plans that everybody's been playing around with aren't sustainable and don't make sense. If there was a way for every person who's connected to every system that they use to derive some percentage of a penny or back with each packet of data transfer, then all that's doing is pulling some of the value out of the chain from all the other players. It's not just that Amazon gets 100% of every packet of data that moves. There are layers and layers and layers of brokers. So this is why I've always thought that regulation on its own, and especially when I hear comparisons to Microsoft, we are not living in a situation that's analogous to Microsoft. Microsoft was a fairly, it was a far less complex system. We're talking about incredibly complex systems that, by the way, are still at the beginning of a 7-decade-long trajectory. So my thinking on this is we've got to figure out a way to incent everybody to come to the table so that there's collaboration. Because right now, we've got fragmentation in the US, so California's law is its own thing. Massachusetts has laws. Chicago, the state of Illinois has laws which conflict with other laws all around the world. And the data right now are minuscule compared to what's coming. There are all kinds of products that are in the process of R&D that will derive behavioral biometric data, which isn't just your fingerprint and your eyeball, but how you're reacting in any given moment at any given time. Similar systems exist for companies, exist in all of these different places. So, I would say that there are other ways to be thinking about this problem.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you at the end for some solution ideas. Matt, before we move to you, though, I want to give the commissioner a chance. Do you want to say anything else about that historical analogy with Microsoft? I know that there are others that feel that is relevant. How do you think about, I guess, when you look historically at cases, how do you think about shaping that or layering that onto the problems of today?
Sure.
Is Google an ad monopoly today? How does that relate to cases in the past? Is it a whole new thing?
Yeah, I think at the core you have to look and follow the money and look at the business model. So it is very, very natural and tempting for a company that owns the domain and controls the marketplace to then start competing on that marketplace because they can either rig the game in their favor, preference themselves, and we have to ask, at what point is that actually pushing out would-be entrants and really harming the entire ecosystem? And that's why I think when we look at Microsoft, which certainly was, I think deterring new folks from entering and competing fairly on their operating system, I think that was a way that we saw we needed to act as the public. And ultimately, I totally agree that there's a lot of complexities and we can't really predict the future about how data is going to be structured and how it will continue to evolve in our society. But let's look at the money. Let's look at where there's a conflict of interest and solve that. And we have done this in so many other regulatory domains. You talk about banking. We separate banking and commerce.
Yeah.
We don't really allow the mischief of banks to get in on the other side. And that's why we have the public set up payment systems, set up some of the flow of currency in order to make sure that commerce can build on top of that rather than it be distorted. And I'm a huge proponent of the Fed building, faster payment systems. The Fed has talked about thinking about a stable coin. So we have to really think about what are those conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
And how do they use government benefits to really abuse their position? I mean, if you think about it, intellectual property, we as a society, we decide we're going to grant trade secrets, trademarks, copyrights, patents, because we believe that will form capital and lead to innovation. But as soon as it gets abused, that's then not in the public interest.
Right.
And that's where we have to ask hard questions. When you are abusing your intellectual property, are you actually really undermining the goals that we set forth to create a vibrant economy?
So this is interesting. And maybe this is really about kind of principles and values and these paradigms of interest rather than getting too in the weeds, technocratic weeds of data. We'll come back to a couple of those points, but Matt, let me bring you in now and touch on something that we've sort of floated around in this regulatory discussion we're having. 5G is huge because businesses of all types are counting on it for innovation and to solve goals around sustainability, inclusiveness, et cetera. But 5G is also kind of in the middle of a brewing standards war. The US and China are moving in different directions. I was speaking to a U.S. chip maker that's saying that he's having trouble even getting in the conversations with European telecoms because of rules that the U.S. has set down. Meanwhile, China is rolling out its own set of 5G standards and equipment throughout the One Belt, One Road problem. What is this all going to mean for the telecoms industry? And what kind of, is it possible when different regions have different value systems and different judgments they're making, are we going to end up with one system? And if not, what happens to the user experience there?
Wow, that was a lot of questions in the same sentence.
It's Davos, baby.
It is Davos, so let's see if we can start here. So GSMA is an association of all mobile operators, and we do standardization, specification work, etc. So I don't agree with the first thing you said, that 5G is huge. 5G is actually very small today. 4G,
it's going to be huge.
4G is becoming something. In 6 years or so, we're going to see the world having maybe 20% 5G penetration, 20%. In 5-6 years, 4G will be 55%.
Okay.
In 5-6 years, 5G will be as big as 3G, so 20%. So we're going to be living coincide with 3G, with 4G, and 5G. The good thing is that it is standardized. 4G was the first technology that was harmonized globally. Same standard. And that's why we can use the same phone in Japan, in Sweden, or in the US, or wherever. 5G is following that harmony. So I'm not concerned that there's going to be different standards. It might be different dialects, but it's certainly going to work. India is trying to do their own 5G tweak to it. We will see many initiatives around that. But what I do think is important, and in this conversation, which I do enjoy, is that if we forget everything we learned today, I think you should remember 50, 40, 10. 50, 40, 10. Because what we're now seeing is that we're talking about data and how are we going to use data and regulation and driving entrepreneurship and so on. Today, still, only 50% of the world is connected to the internet. That's the first 50. And predominantly through a mobile device. 40% of the world's population live beneath a 3G or 4G broadband coverage, and soon 5G. But they live beneath the 3G, 4G. And they could theoretically connect, but they choose not to. And then you have 10% that does not have any coverage. They don't have any possibility to connect. And that's, of course, a coverage gap that needs to be sorted, and we're working with that with other partners. Now, the 40%, the usage gap, how do we solve that? And why do people not connect to the internet? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons. One is affordability. I don't have money, right? It's taxed very high in certain countries. Other issues is skills. I have money, but I really don't know how to use it. The third thing is the stigma around internet. There's all bad things happening on internet. So, no, I don't want to even be close to the internet. That's number 3. And then number 4, back to what we're talking about here, entrepreneurship and getting things going, is that, I have money, I have skills, I'm okay with the potential risk of being on the internet, but there's nothing there for me. There's no content that is local, that is relevant. And if we see where the app development is happening, it is happening in two places. It's happening in the US and it's happening in China. But those populations are largely connected. Take Eurasia, you take Africa, you take South Asia, huge unconnected population. Very limited innovation happening right there. So for us to move from having only 50% connected to the internet, we need to make sure that we foster an entrepreneurial climate in those areas. Not just vitamin pills, but proper penicillin for people to actually get what they really need. And that's where you need innovation.
Okay.
And entrepreneurship.
Well, fingers crossed, but I don't get the sense that even if we had a new president or a new, this big tech trade war is going to go away. So it does seem like we're headed towards, regional systems. And actually on that point, Rohit, I'm going to ask you about the conversation between Europe and the US on regulation and how all that might play out. We now see in Europe, Vestager is sort of talking about putting more burden of proof on companies, which is in some ways, again, kind of a nod to the finance model. I'm wondering if that's something that you're thinking about too, and the question of asymmetry, that's come up a couple of times in various points here. I mean, when I think about the asymmetry in the market transaction between, say, a Google and an Amazon and anybody else on the other side, that's a black box. I mean, there's essentially no regulation of that black box right now. That's much more opaque than, say, even CDOs were before the financial crisis. Is that something you guys are like? What are you talking about when you dig into these regulatory conversations? What part of this feels most worrisome and where the action is?
Well, I think there are so many disparate conversations about problems we see in the digital economy, and this ranges from everything from fake news to incitement of violence to counterfeit goods flowing. There are a whole host of issues that are raising questions. Do we need a big bureaucracy of content moderation? Do we need to closely and surgically look at every single transaction? I think one of the things that we forget is that a lot of these problems that we see online are actually a small-scale reflection of the business model that is really about mass surveillance and hoarding of data. And here's what we know. Enragement equals engagement. So of course, things that are harmful content that may be extremist are reinforced by some of these business models. This is the surveillance-based advertising model, which is when an individual user is going to go down rabbit holes fed by a recommendation algorithm or by curation on a news feed, and that is part of the business. The more you are watching, the more you are clicking, that's more data that they are taking from you and monetizing. And why they are doing it is because of that surveillance-based advertising model or behavioral advertising. And until we address whether that is simply just manipulation, we're not going to be able to solve some of this. And Europe and the US, I think, certainly are thinking hard about a range of these questions. Of course, there's going to be our own cultural values that we bring to this. And frankly, I have a hard message for many people, which is it's not really the job of governments to cut and paste each other's laws. We're supposed to reflect the actual values of our citizens who we are accountable to. And if that means that a multinational company needs to comply with more than one set of laws, well, that's what that's how our Earth is organized.
One follow-up question, and then I'm going to ask a couple others on the panel. Do you think that CDA 230 should be rolled back? And so just for those that don't know, CDA 230 is the loophole that was put in the mid-1990s that allows most of what happens on platforms like Facebook or Google, or YouTube, to be exempt from liability in the way that, say, a newspaper or a broadcaster would be.
Yeah, well, I think if you think about it, we can embrace the idea that a dumb pipe, shouldn't be liable for what flows through it. Whether it's a fax machine or a telephone line, what is being sent through that, maybe it doesn't make sense to hold that the plumbing accountable for it. But as soon as that plumbing or that infrastructure is pushing certain types of content or pushing certain types of behavior, they're no longer a passive participant, they're an active participant. And I have questioned whether Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and its goals are at all aligned with the behavioral advertising model, which is very explicit in targeting content not to a broad audience, but to an individual. And I just think we're going to need to really look hard and reform that.
That's interesting. Amy, what do you think about that?
Again, my concern always when we talk about definitions and policies is that we tend to use only the existing data and examples that we see today. And let me give you a clear-cut example that goes back to the 5G conversation. So a lot of people have connected devices in their homes now. Amazon, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, all around the world. You can get sub-$30 smart speakers. There are smart refrigerators. There's smart, you name it. So in the 90s, some of you fellow nerds might have, there was a way to install some software on your computer where you could donate the unused compute time back to Berkeley for science. Some of you are nodding because we were the cool nerds who did that. I donated my unused compute back to the search for extraterrestrial life. So this was a way to harness other computers around the world, pool that compute together to create a supercomputer network that was affordable. Fast forward to today, there are a handful of services that have launched. There's something called Golem that allows you to download a piece of software on your phone and then rent out. So you're no longer doing this out of the good of your heart, you're doing this to make money. So you rent out space, unused compute space while you are sleeping, whether that's currently on your phone or pretty soon on your smart speakers, your smart refrigerator, the smart whatever lawn watering system you have, and others can, through a brokerage system, not research scientists, but other people, buy that time. Here's why I'm asking you this question, because today we're worried about behavioral targeting and advertising, which we should be. We are not yet, I'm not hearing yet, behavioral biometric targeting, which is a whole other thing. And I've literally never heard a single policymaker talk about what do we do when we have all of these people renting out their devices at night. Does that create new kinds of digital divides unlike we've ever seen before? Does this start to fundamentally shift our economies in ways that we haven't yet thought? Does this open us up to entirely new kinds of cybersecurity risks? Because some companies don't publish firmware. I mean, people don't upgrade their firmware as often as they should, right? So the concern that I have is that these are questions about the future, and the infrastructure of policymaking and regulation and rules fundamentally deals with the present and the past. Can't regulate ahead for things that haven't happened yet. So is there a way, instead of the brute force of regulation, because just because antitrust happens doesn't mean that government's going to fill in on the innovation side and solve the problems that the marketplace was trying to solve for. So I would just, I think we are living in a much more complex place today than we ever have been. I think deep uncertainty warrants deep questions and a much more sophisticated approach to whatever the future solutions could be.
Okay, Matt, so you want to just...
Yeah, no, I completely agree with it. almost unfair to believe that a regulator will be able to regulate and think forward. I mean, I'm in this industry for the past 30 years, and I'm struggling to see what's going to happen in the next couple of years. So how can a regulator even dream of being right? So what we think is we do need to have regulation. So I mean, that's absolutely so, but it needs to be light touch, and we believe it needs to be more policy-led, and then let the companies be accountable for what is put on there. A little bit to what you were saying, that if you're a dumb pipe, fine, if you're just a post office. But once you start to get into intelligent connectivity using AI, algorithms, or big data, or coupled with IoT information, then all of a sudden you're not a dumb pipe. You're actually a pretty intelligent pipe. And you need to be part of taking accountability of what is being pushed through and being exposed to you as an individual. I think we all have the numerous examples of when you have been searching for a wine cooler, for instance, or buying a wine cooler, and all of a sudden everything that you see on the internet is around wine coolers. And Jesus, all of a sudden the world is flooded with wine coolers. And it's the same thing as you're saying, we're being sort of pulled into this, believing that the world is around wine cooler. So certainly we need, as industries, build the trust, take accountability for how regulation should be implemented. And regulators, we believe, should be more policy on a higher level.
Well, can I just push back on an element of this, which is, I don't think regulators should micromanage businesses. But I think we should go to the core principle, which is, what has fueled so much innovation and delivered so much benefits to society? And that really is a fiercely competitive market, where the market leader feels that someone is coming from behind them and it pushes them to go harder. And the benefits of competition, people often say, well, what is going to be the cost of any potential antitrust action? I think we need to be much more concerned about what is sometimes the cost of just sitting and waiting until we can try and figure everything out? What innovation have we missed out on? What breakthrough gains have we lost because maybe we haven't been assertive enough on that?
It's an interesting point, because statistics show that actually in the last 20 years, as concentration has gone up, entrepreneurial zeal in the U.S. has gone down in a variety of areas, in part because of this. Nandan, I want to bring you into the conversation too, and if you want to share any thoughts on what's been discussed, but also just a couple of other points. Is India presenting a kind of alternative model in Asia for the Chinese surveillance state model? And if so, how? What lessons can we take? And also, there's now almost a sort of a civil war in certain tech companies, and that seems to be spreading across the industry, of workers advocating for change, of workers not feeling comfortable with their own business models and their own ways of working. How do you see that evolving?
Well, I think it's certainly a much more what we call as an inclusive internet, where people are able to take advantage of their own data to improve their lives. So if you have a person, think of it this way, if a person in India has a per capita income of $2,000 and has a smartphone, and somebody in Boston is $40,000 smartphone, their digital footprint is the same, because they both use the same devices. If there's a way that the person owning $2,000 can take advantage of the data to get a better loan, or to get better healthcare, or to get better skills, or to get better jobs, then you actually made the data work in their favor. And that's the whole philosophy, that rather than data being concentrated only in companies and governments, be it for commerce or surveillance, if data can be put in the hands of users, you are now empowering them. And that's the basic philosophy. And certainly it is a different philosophy of an inclusive model. I explained how 330 million people opened bank accounts in 7 years. So it is really, how do we use the power of modern tech in an inclusive way so that everybody can participate and gain from the economic upside. So that's the philosophy. On the other point, I think it's a good thing that employees in large companies are questioning what's happening, because finally this business is about which companies can attract and retain the best talent. And therefore, if your talent itself is questioning your bona fides, that will also lead to a sort of introspection, along with, of course, the external questioning by regulators. So I think it'll all help in correcting some of the aberrations that have crept in.
So we're at a big change point. We've only got 2 minutes left. It was such a good conversation that I haven't opened up yet, but maybe we have time for a quick question or two if there's someone burning to ask something. Okay, in the front.
Jonathan Haskell, Imperial College. I enjoyed the discussion very much indeed, but at the heart of it, it seems to me, is something that you said earlier in your introduction, Rana, which is that this new economy, these types of firms, they are just deeply concentrated on intangible assets. And the minute one understands that, it seems to me that a lot of this all becomes a little bit clearer. Intangible assets like data and software, one can scale up, but also it's very difficult for new firms to come in because they're hard to borrow against. So if we want reactive competition and all the things, Rohit, that you've talked about, I just wonder whether we ought to be looking towards the inadequacy of the financial market and the difficulties that new firms have as being a possible source of some of the difficulties.
Great.
Enjoyed the discussion very much.
Great point. And also, by the way, for those that don't know, Jonathan wrote the book on this topic, which is fantastic. Rohit?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very fair question. Are our capital markets today set up for those good ideas to actually get the funding at a reasonable cost and scale? Because right now, I think the way it's working is you actually see a lot of venture capital investors saying, I don't even want to invest in anything that I can't sell potentially to one of the big dominant firms.
Yeah.
I don't want to invest in anything that maybe they might copy. And I think this is, we see it in the data. We see that fewer firms of certain sizes will not go public. They have a tougher time challenging some of that dominance. And I think we have to think hard about how do we get our capital markets ready for more investment in these types of fields without really just solidifying dominance of the existing incumbents, which many of them now have their own venture capital arms and are extremely acquisitive. Does that just mean that new innovations are simply there to embed in their business model rather than disrupt?
Yeah.
Could I add one quick thing?
Very quick.
So if it was the case that every government, including our own, was investing as they should be in basic research, would we be in a situation where so much innovation is beholden to the large companies to whom they hope someday to sell their IP?
Okay. So much more that we could go into, but we're at time. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you very much.